Good morning and welcome to the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. I'm Stefan Clark, Chief Client Officer at the firm, and in the studio with me I have James Grigor, Investment Strategist. The global order is shifting with rising autocracies, evolving alliances like Five Eyes, and rapid technological advancements reshaping power dynamics. These changes are redefining international stability, trade, and security, presenting important questions about New Zealand's geopolitical position and economic direction. Joining us from Chicago, Alex Grigor is an expert in international relations, cyber warfare, and AI. With over 20 years of experience, he has advised governments on foreign policy, co-authored AI and cybersecurity papers, and worked as a geopolitical analyst, providing insights into the forces shaping our world. Today, we will examine the role of cybersecurity and AI in modern geopolitics, the impact of shifting alliances, including the significance of Chinese warships in the Tasman Sea. We will also explore what these macro developments mean for global stability and trade, and how investors in New Zealand can and perhaps should think about the evolving landscape. Alex, it's fantastic to have you here, all the way from Chicago. Look, let's kick into it with a big question, which I'm sure you'll have lots of thoughts on. How do you see the balance of power shifting, and what are the key drivers behind it?
Just a small question to kick things off.
Yeah. Here we go. Well, thank you very much, Stefan and James, for having me on. I think that is a question that is at the forefront of most international politicians and people who are looking at geopolitics and trying to figure out is this a sort of form of business as usual that is just taking some funny twists, or are we seeing some real shifts? And I think it wouldn't be too controversial of me to say I think we are seeing some shifts, and I think that the main driver is the US. And I think, sitting here in the US, I live in New York, we definitely feel some pretty seismic domestic policy shifts going on, and just the way that the sort of intentions and outcomes of the current administration, and then filtering that through into the international sphere. I think that one of the most obvious things is this sort of strange tension that the US has between non-interventionism, so that they're pulling back, they're very much focused at the enemy within, if you like. They're looking at domestic sort of politics as their primary focus point, and so they're pulling out of or off, if you like, the world stage in many ways quite dramatically. We can sort of mention spheres of influence throughout Africa and Asia, and stepping back from its European allies as being some fairly major ones, without even getting into what's happened with Ukraine this week, which is pretty seismic as well, I'd say. But the other part of that tension is that they're also looking to reshape certain alliances, and Trump specifically seems to look to reset a certain type of relationship with Russia and with China. He blows hot and cold. So there's a lot of talks of tariffs and things, but there's also constant mentions that they're going to get deals done. So Trump, particularly in the administration, is a very transactional form of language. It's looking very much at what's in it for the US, and we could even boil that down to what's in it for certain parts of the US, certain companies and industries, I think is one way to look at it. And so we're going back to, again, a lot of talk of we're going back to sort of a 19th century form of, 20th century, 1900s form of like zero-sum thinking. The idea that the sort of neoliberal global order, which is a rules-based, a high tide raises all boats kind of attitude, is now going back to competition for scarce resources sort of attitudes. and that there are winners and losers, and that you are either on the winning team or the losing team. And so that's sort of how I think we start to think of alliances again, particularly if we're thinking of New Zealand's relationship to the US and so on. It becomes very much a transactional mindset that I think policymakers in New Zealand have to start thinking about, and much less sort of this global vision of an ideas, and democracy and all of these terms that we've lived with throughout our entire lifetimes, seems to be giving way to much more power politic, realpolitik thinking, and that is the stage into which enters China, particularly in as a regional power. So where we might have thought of the US as the head of a fairly unipolar world. I don't want to use too much technical jargon here, but the idea that it's the central power of a giant alliance of democracies and rules-based system, legal precedents, trade, commerce, and all that sort of thing. Now it seems like there's a little bit of a carving up of spheres of influence, and so you're looking more at regions. And part of that is the vacuum is being left. I'd say this is very much happening in real time, but is being left by the US. And I think you see some opportunistic movements from China in that thing. I think they were expecting this, and so that's.
Alex, is this an output that they want to happen, or is this a ramification of some of the more domestic decision making that it turned? Because are they sitting there going, we're in a unipolar world and we want to change it to have spheres of influence geographically or something, or is this just an outcome because they're doing some things that are quite different, and this is what happens when you do that?
Yeah, I mean, super interesting. I think I think that there is, my opinion is there's a lot of short-termism thinking. So I'm not sure if they are thinking in world structures. They're thinking in small, quick economic gains. So I'm not sure if that sort of, the global alliance structure and all of that is, but the perhaps even more importantly, the overriding narrative is that the US has not benefited from the system, and you can absolutely argue the contrapoint to that, and I think you would do pretty well. But that is the current administration's take. That's certainly the rhetoric, anyway, is that the US had not maximized its position as the global hegemon, as the top dog, as the most powerful thing. It had not got as much rent as it should have in seeking it, and so in recasting its position in the world, it's going to jettison any country or any region that it doesn't deem terribly interesting or important, and focus on some great power play and onshoring of industry and things, and manufacturing. So that's the sort of mindset, I would say, is very much looking at the world as I said before, as a transactional sort of marketplace, and rather than sort of a power play. There's also just the assumption, and I don't think it's an incorrect assumption, that it still is the most powerful nation state, and so that sort of has yet to be challenged in any sort of meaningful way. So I don't think there's a lot of concern with the current administration that is slipping away in any form. In fact, they would probably argue that they're consolidating it.
One lens, and just thinking about mindset that I try to explore what's going on through, is there seems to be a shift from principles or rules-based, as you've called it, to pragmatism, economic pragmatism or negotiating pragmatism. And if you operate in a transactional world with a transactional mindset, then you behave in a way that is fastest to achieving the exact outcome you want, rather than trying to fit it within a broader framework. Do you think that is a fair, or how do you sort of think about that in the context of what's going on in the States?
I absolutely think that's right, Stefan, and I think pragmatism is a good mode with which to understand a lot of the transactional behavior below perhaps some of the top brass in the US and perhaps you could say in other powerful countries. And what I mean by that is I think pragmatism is what we have to do ourselves to engage with trying to understand. But I think that there is an inexplicable irrationality about some of the decision making that is very hard to call it pragmatic. Um, and so I think the language of pragmatism is used. We're going to do this, we're going to do X, and we're going to get Y. You know, there's going to be a sort of a cause and an outcome. But I think the actions and the what that actually is doesn't strike many as being very rational or being very considered in some ways. In fact, a lot of it seems quite temperate, emotionally driven, feelings driven. There's, I'm sure you have this in New Zealand. There's the vibes, economics, and so on. And so that makes it quite tricky for the US. I think outside the US, and whatever it behaves, it certainly creates waves of uncertainty. And I think that sort of sowing chaos is part of the strategy. In fact, I think if you cannot predict what the US is going to do, the feeling within the US is that gives them the edge, that gives them an upper hand, right? And so they can go into any sort of negotiating position with something that they can seemingly give up because they've created this turbulence to begin with. So you could argue that is a form of pragmatic approach to negotiating. But outside the US, and certainly in the more regional and just thinking globally, I think it absolutely has retrenched to less of a rules-based system. Although countries are still clinging on to those words. We saw, and I know we'll get onto this in a little bit, but when we see the language of what and where the Chinese warships were positioned, it was a lot of international waters, and did they break any international laws and so on. If you're a great power, if you're China, if you're the US, if you're Russia, if you are often Brazil, you break these international laws as you feel fit. You're not beholden to them at all. There's no enforcement mechanism, and so in that sense, it's sort of rules and laws for you, but not for me. And so what does that mean as to how we think about the global world order? And back to your point, if this neoliberal world order, and I think the sort of decline of globalization or globalism has been ongoing for a while. I don't think it's a sudden thing. I think these retrenchments has been in the process for quite a while. Brexit votes, we can sort of look at all sorts of indicators of that. And this is I think, populism in its forms in countries all around the world. We see it, in recent German elections and so on. It's capitalizing on that idea that we're no longer a global community or a global society or a giant sort of trading bloc that's peace through, interdependence and peace through trade and so on, but rather a retrenchment and a hardening of borders. And I think, yeah,
in a environment where it's no longer rules based, that China example is really interesting, because I think New Zealand has no other option but we're not going to go over there with a frigate, if we've got any left that haven't sunk, and try and tell China to sort of leave international waters. And so, of course, we're going to use rule-based. But if that's no longer the method of response, does that mean there's more conflict, or does that just mean there's people doing, or countries rather, doing their own thing and keeping to themselves, and maybe that affects trade, etc.? Or do you think it actually leads to more conflict, and and leads to perhaps, this is perhaps escalating my question and comment too much, but if China saw the response of their warships near the coast of Australia being a couple of rules based, hey, this is illegal, and absolutely zero response from our bigger, defensive allies like the US, does that mean that China thinks that actually we could own APAC if we really wanted to?
There's no, in my opinion, well, I don't know if it is my opinion. I've read, some people argue that there's no stronger show of power than breaking commonly held rules and conventions with impunity. Because if there's no consequence, because no one's willing to challenge it, as you said before, in this case, they're in the sea, in the Tasman Sea, and no one's going to do anything about it. It goes to how much strength each of these powers, or even in a negotiating situation, the same thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah. I think you're both absolutely right, James. I think one of the things we have to think about is if there's a retrenchment. I mean, we can look back at history to say the more retrenchment and the more nationalistic nation states become, the more fearful they become, the more warmongering they become, and this sort of alludes a little bit what I mentioned earlier, that it's sort of they then start to interpret the world as a zero sum. It's us or them. The one caveat to that, even though I talked about globalization sort of rolling back, we're still incredibly interconnected, much more than at any time in history. So, there are still, lots of cobwebs of alliances and interactions and things that would make that, I don't foresee that as being imminent in any way. And so I don't
overplay it, is what you mean, because actually, in the end, the US still needs raw materials from China, and China still needs New Zealand milk, for example.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. We're not each interdependent. We're interdependent. We're not independent. And the other part of it is, it seems like a lot of the big powers are quite happy to carve up the world into spheres of influence, but not sort of shape the fundamentals below that into, I don't. No one should be in the prediction game, especially in political science. But there doesn't seem to be an imminent global conflict because of this. It's sort of a reshuffling of the deck, a re sort of configuration of alliances. But in terms of the impunity, the behaving with impunity, and doing something without any consequences, I think that's just exposing what was always there, which is there is no enforcement mechanism, or the Hobbesian, there is no Leviathan, there is no overarching world government or world police force. So that was always a risk with the rules-based system, is that everyone had to nod to it and agree. And the sort of flagrant breaking of these rules, which is going to, I think, increase, especially as the US starts to do it, leaves us in a position of, where are we power politically and so on. But the question remains, is it still in their interest to break the economic sphere? And a lot of people will start to say, perhaps there are two sort of theaters, if you like. There's one that's the political and the power, and then there's an economic one. Absolutely, economic gives you power, but they're less inclined to break the markets and trade and commerce in such a way that it's irreparable, because that is what's giving them a lot of advantage. And the problem New Zealand has in particular is it is bifurcated. It is split two ways. It takes its defensive posture from the US as its umbrella alliance and defensive partner, but the biggest trading partner in terms of commerce is China. Now, when China and the US set up against each other in quite such a stark way, and perhaps you could say this has been coming for some time, but very much sort of in that posture, it pulls New Zealand defensively and security wise in one way, and economically and markets wise perhaps in another. And that is, it's not unique to New Zealand, but it's certainly a tricky, tricky situation to try and negotiate and navigate. And it depends what China wants to do with its Asia Pacific region. If it's just being a little bit bellicose, just to sort of say, this is leave this part alone, or if it wants something more than that. Yeah,
That's probably a good time to delve a bit more into New Zealand and where it fits within this context. And one place that I guess everybody's going, it's not a new thought, but Five Eyes and what that means now with the US's response to global events and how New Zealand is generally fitted into that I guess mechanism, and what happens now.
yeah, a very good question. And I mean, we're talking now at a point where I think no one can confidently say for sure what the ultimate outcomes of this are. It would seem to me that Five Eyes is going to, probably already has, and is going to continue to undergo some fairly fundamental changes to the point of possibly becoming stagnant as an organization. There's a couple of indicators of that. One is Peter Navarro in the US government saying that Canada should be kicked out of Five Eyes was a pretty extraordinary statement. He walked that back. But that, that sort of rhetoric sort of is pretty extraordinary, especially with your closest ally and neighbor. But and the idea that that was tied to some sort of tariffs and trading negotiating goes back again. I keep going back to it, but that transactional thinking, everything filters through what is it financially in it for us. So Five Eyes is sort of as I'm sure a lot of your listeners and viewers will know, is five nations that share intelligence, and they gather it through signal intelligence or human, and it's sort of a clearinghouse of five alliances. They're all English speaking for a reason. There's no translation difficulties, and lots of countries have tried to. Israel recently have all tried to join Five Eyes, but it's a pretty exclusive club. Britain, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand. And so what usually happens is you will gather intelligence and you'll send it through the shared clearinghouse saying, this may be of interest to everyone. We've noticed this, we've spotted this. What do others think? And another partner might say, well, that's interesting because we've seen the same or the opposite. And that's sort of how it sort of becomes. There is an ability to put so in New Zealand's case, for New Zealand eyes only. And we're seeing that increasingly, each of the five members tending to withhold more and more intelligence sharing. And that suggests that they don't trust what's going to be done with that intelligence. The US seems to be a leaky boat in terms of intelligence and what comes out generally. I think the people who've been installed in the US as heads of intelligence departments, maybe there's a wait and see part to it, and the other part is it seems like, and from the first Trump administration, intelligence from wherever it came, and there was a famous episode where Trump happily shared a piece of Australian intel, if it was to his or the US's benefit. And so a lot of human intelligence officers and everything's identities were burned and all of that sort of thing, just because it was in the US's interest to let China know. And so I think for those reasons, that's going to become a fairly dormant activity. And then, going back to what we're talking about with, another interesting alliance, perhaps that's up for renegotiating as AUKUS. It seems like the UK and Australia are going to be, I would hazard a guess. It's not come up on any conversation, any speeches from Trump, but it seems like that's probably not going to continue. I don't think he will see an economic benefit to giving away US nuclear submarines. He desperately wants to keep as much of that hardware as they can. So I don't think that those
So now the
submarines are
US
coming.
have to go back to the French.
Well, right. So either back to the French, the Australians, and the British are going to have to rethink what that arrangement looks like, and is there a role now for New Zealand in that? And if dropping the nuclear part of it, it would be very interesting to see New Zealand and Australia looking back over to Europe again after all these years as their security alliance. I'm not going to, who knows, but you can see that as being one possible scenario for sure.
Do you, what do you think the signaling from the Chinese incoming to the Tasman Sea, what was that about, and what should we make of it?
I think there's a couple do you remember did you guys ever see the movie 13 Days? It's about the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Kevin Costner movie. And there's a scene where there's a naval blockade, and the Secretary of Defense stands up and says, "Stop firing your cannons and stuff. This is a language. These are two great powers or leaders talking to each other through these ships, the maneuvers, the firing over the bow. This is a form of language." And I think that that's quite accurate. I think that that's what's happening. I think China, to James's point, is absolutely putting its frigates near in the Tasman Sea to see what the initial reaction is, and how the dialogue or protest, or however you want to frame it, starts or begins, or what sort of approach Australia and New Zealand take. What are their capabilities? It seems like some of the ways that we found out about that through commercial pilots suggest there aren't very great capabilities of, I would say that's because Australia and New Zealand are in a very much in a peacetime posture, right? There's no reason to suspect anything going on. So why would you have a stand-up set of frigates and so on, like patrolling? But I think that it's so it's partly for the Chinese to see what the reaction will be, to see if the US particularly will respond. They haven't, not a word, not even as far as I'm aware, back channeling anything. And so the final part of that is very much opening dialogue. I hesitate to sort of anthropomorphize it in that way, but the idea that China is saying, particularly to the US and perhaps to Europe as well, this is now our sphere. We're down here. We're perfectly entitled to be down here because this is our part of the globe. And I think that that's primarily what that was. It's interesting that they're doing that off in the Tasman Sea. They're also doing it just off the coast of Vietnam, and then continuing in Taiwan. So they're very much carving out a spheres of influence. Like, this is ours, and if anyone's got a problem, speak up. No,
Which they haven't.
let's say that that's the case. So then the question becomes, well, what next? What does that mean for New Zealand? What does that mean for the regions? And I don't think much for now. What happened in the Cook Islands recently, I think, is a clue as to how China will behave with our smaller dependents, and I'm talking in terms of the realm of New Zealand, but other small island nations and so on that are often desperate for for cheap investment. And so, how that filters back to New Zealand and the influence campaign, there are all sorts of historical precedents we can look at, but I think it's too early to say for sure. I think that China definitely wants to shore up a lot of the products and things it buys from New Zealand, and I think it's quite happy to keep doing that, and probably quite happy to increase that. And so that's a consideration New Zealand might have to think about. Do we want to form a closer relationship? What will that mean? It will mean dropping any objection to an independent Taiwan. Is any politician prepared to do that yet? I don't think so. But that's probably the conversations that will start happening.
And then that gets harder and harder to say no to if on the other side your security partner is no longer really wanting to be your security partner. Not explicitly, but they're just implicitly concentrating on.
Absolutely. Imagine New Zealand puts its neck out and says it will defend Taiwan at all costs, and there are crickets. There are no one else that comes in behind to back up that statement. That's a pretty risky position to be taking, sadly. But anyway. So those are things coming down. Yeah.
The risk of conflict shifting in other ways too, isn't it? And we're seeing a ever increasing sort of lurch. I don't know if that's the right word, but increase in cyber related activity and cyber warfare, and obviously the rise of AI and the power that might bring, both in terms of what it could mean for conflict, but also in other areas, positive areas perhaps. How do you think that fits within the broader shift? And obviously Russia and China and other parts of the world have quite a lot of, or known for their strength and capabilities in the cyber warfare space.
Yeah, I would still argue we're very much at the nascent stage of cyber conflict. I think the best is yet to come, if you like. I think that lots could happen in all sorts of ways that are perhaps less obvious than some of the sort of blockbuster movies lead us to believe. I don't think it would sort of be, taking over, critical infrastructure and shutting down power stations, but much more low-level pernicious cyber activity. And it was interesting that the US has disbanded its unit that was monitoring Russian cyber activity and declared it a non-threat, which was peculiarly fascinating declaration. And so what's going on there? And I think part of it is that they don't think it rises to the level of governments, that it's sort of, industries and companies and stuff's responsibility to take on some of that defensive posture and shore up their data and customers and so on. AI has changed the thinking completely in many ways. You can build a pretty sophisticated cyber weapon with AI nowadays pretty quickly. So, it's sort of being a destabilizing effect in that way. AI is actually fascinating generally, especially in the US. So the US has gone all in on its domination of artificial intelligence, and it's very obvious to see where that lies. I think you can measure GDP in the US primarily by looking at the top 7 to 10 companies led by NVIDIA. I mean, it really has gone all in. All of the venture capital funding, everything is going to AI, and the term that they all use is investing in agents. So agents are sort of the level below sort of large language model, where they might use AI for specific tasks. It might try and hunt the disease, or it might book a plane ticket. And so that's quite interesting, because you could have made an argument a few weeks ago, a month ago, that was going to be carved up a little bit like we see the giant social medias and tech companies. You're going to have the Googles and the Microsofts and the Facebook, whatever. And DeepSeek somewhat disrupted that thinking by, I think it's fair to say that its claim that it built its sophisticated model for $6 million is not quite accurate, but still, it's sort of suboptimal or inferior microchips and less money than the billions and billions and billions that OpenAI and stuff have taken suggests that perhaps there's many more companies at play. And so, in that sense, you could say that perhaps those to gain the most from the democratization of the AI space in terms of investing and so on is the consumer. That would be a race to zero. It would be pennies for these apps or these agents that we would buy. So it'd be good for the consumer. There'd be lots of options. There'd be eventually a consolidation. So there's sort of two schools of thought there, that either it's going to sort of consolidate in these few big companies, or it's going to be worldwide and lots of countries can have a piece of this. And there's no reason to think, if the latter is true, New Zealand couldn't play a part in that.
That's the thing, that the DeepSeek was looked upon as so negative, and if you're looking at it from a geopolitical China versus US, perhaps you could argue it is if you're sort of on Team USA, but actually it's really positive in the sense that you can create perhaps the over-capitalized capital expenditure by these big tech companies on NVIDIA chips is such an inefficient use of capital, and it means it gets monopolized amongst the great companies with huge balance sheets. But actually, this shows that actually two guys in a garage in Palmerston North can also perhaps, maybe that's a little bit.
Well, they will have to start somewhere. I love the story of DeepMind, the British AI company that started up and then got bought out by Google for however many billions. But they were very much a bootstrap couple of computer scientists, and their objective originally was to try and design a program that won a very old game of Go. Now, I don't know if it's like a very sophisticated form of chess. And so I think that's right. I think both there's an opportunity there. And again, you don't have to build you can build these agents that just sit below. New Zealand might be very good at building, agricultural versions of whatever it might be. And our position, the New Zealand position, I should say, is, as sitting on the edge of whatever, it could very much do it in ways that we can't think of. And I think there is a lot of exciting opportunities there. The other part is that I think a lot of those smaller and sort of outside the main player activities will happen outside the US, because the US is very much in the mode of trying to consolidate, and any whiff of competition is immediately aggressively bought up by the big players, and they are also in a domestic environment where the very big players get rewarded, and if they're known to the administration, and the smaller ones probably not so much. So I think a lot of that exciting development will develop outside the US, which is great. I think that's how it should be. So I do see AI as both. And I'm parking for a moment the sort of fears of AI and the singularity and the science fictionism of it, and particularly if we translate that to taking away jobs. And there are many, many different ways you can slice that sort of argument, and nobody knows, I think, is the short answer. There is one more component that's coming online, which is quantum computing, and we've just seen that that's coming up, and that will be an interesting take as well. But in any case, though, that technological part, the US has used its technological dominance as part of its power. And the Biden administration had worked very hard to make sure China could not access these advanced chips. There's a very, very specific way that lithograph machines are positioned between the Netherlands and the US and the Taiwanese computer chip companies, and so they'd set up this system where the US was going to dominate this market, and it looks like that didn't work. Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting, right? How when DeepSeek became very widely known as I guess as a tool, how shares, of the major of the big players quickly repriced, and everyone got really worried. And I suppose on the one hand, if you're a shareholder and you're sitting at the edge of you're not convinced this is the one for you, say, that might be enough to tip the marginal seller over and start selling. But they recovered for the most part pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And
so
I guess there's another way to look at it, which is, I guess, my broader question is it's sort of a short-term, long-term question. And the short term, of course, is that a whole lot of capital has been deployed, perhaps for within these large companies towards advancing AI. But longer term, the broader productivity gains will accrue both to them and more broadly if there are more providers. And so
I think that's right.
And as there are more providers with more tools and or more agents that they can use, and even if they're being bought out, the great thing about these really, really large companies is they can, if the use case is strong, they can distribute it through society at a pace that, say, DeepSeek couldn't, or another agent provider. If Google buys your business, Google can deploy it across the whole world close to overnight, right? Which others cannot. So there's push and pull in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, Stefan. And let's not forget, DeepSeek was able to distribute very quickly on the Apple platform. It was an app download that had to use Apple and the Google Play. So to your point, you can't build this thing in your garage and then take over the world the following week. And so I think these big players, it was very interesting seeing NVIDIA lose $600 billion. And then gain a lot of that. It just reported earnings, it just beat expectations, yesterday or something. And so it suggests that there's still long-term good feelings about this, and it certainly it's building parts of the infrastructure and the product that is needed. These enormous centers and these enormous types of very sophisticated chips and processors. That I think you're right. I think that there's sort of space and room for it all.
That's sort of how healthcare works now. It used to be that the big pharmaceutical companies researched and investigated drugs and then launched them, and now it's sort of a spoken wheel model where you have lots of little players looking at really, really interesting things with trying to bootstrap it and get funding and government funding and things, and then if it looks like it works, a GSK or a Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer will then jump on them, pay them a few $1 billion, and then use their might to export it to the world.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of acquisition activity and so on. I think that's right. And then the more players that play, the more innovation there is, the more it will advance quicker and all that sort of thing. There is a lot of fear in the amongst the citizenry and general population of is this a good thing? Should we be moving this fast and breaking this many things? The second part to that is, well, it's not clear what's broken yet, but they are certainly moving very fast. And I think it's on the one hand, there's a lot of opportunity. What is his name at LinkedIn? Reid Hoffman and thinks that AI is going to be a net benefit for us, health wise, education wise. We can all have our own tutors. We can all have our own personal doctors at for no cost. And on the other hand, as I said before, how does this sort of play out in the global workforce and so on? It's all up in the air at the moment. But as a geopolitical power play and a tool in that sense, like who's dominating this sort of race, and that's the part that's right now very interesting, and it's always been US versus China. but I think that especially, DeepSeek and Meta and things that are making all this thing open source, it might play out quite differently to that. It might take away some of that sort of geopolitical power of it and become more of an opportunity for investors.
I think that's fascinating because one should always look at history. It doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme about when this has happened before. And unfortunately, my historic references aren't probably as good as yours, Alex. But it seems just fascinating that you've got this big change in the political sphere of the US and the thought about what we discussed at the start of our discussion. At the same time, which is totally separate, but now very, very much intertwined, is this new technology. And it just so happens that it's happening all at the same time, which makes it, I guess, I don't think one caused the other, and so to speak, but they're so interlinked now about what happens next.
And what's so fascinating about that is going back to my point that the 7 to 10, depending on who you ask, of these mainly tech companies are driving the US economy, certainly the stock market, and they are what give the US its 2.3% growth on year. And so if that is still going strong, and by all indicators the market is still relatively happy, it seems quite decoupled from the turmoil of the geopolitical realignments and the carving up of spheres of influence, and that's super fascinating.
And that's something that Trump
seems like then no, and Trump. I mean, it's certainly an indicator that Trump looks at quite a lot, we are told, and that he would be very concerned at precipitous falls and so on. I mean, we might touch on this briefly about what tariffs and trade would do to that, but I think just going back to your point, James, like the markets would usually give you a sense of sentiment in the political sphere or in the geopolitics of what's coming up, and it's not clear that to me, I mean, perhaps you think differently, but it's not clear that they're giving us worried signals at the moment. We could be the calm before the storm, but
I think what the markets are forward-looking, but they also, or I believe at least, that they're efficient somewhat, and so they are taking in the information that's there, and the information that's there is Trump and his tech bros, for want of a better word, that are sort of running policy.
Exactly what it is. Yeah.
Is good for share markets, and so you might get that actually we're on the same side as investors, and everybody wants it to go up because that helps with their dominance around AI.
Well, these companies are seeing, already seeing and foreseeing a great shift to deregulation, and so there'll be much more hands-off, sort of freewheeling, and they're also seeing, I think, favorable terms for certain companies I mentioned before. So and enormous corporate tax breaks. So all of this is helping, I think, drive that sentiment, that positive sentiment. Yeah.
$40 million to Melania Trump for a documentary helps as well.
$40 million share, and 4.5 trillion in tax breaks. Yeah.
Decoupling's quite a powerful word, actually, because I guess as you know, we invest our clients' capital and try and look to build it over time, and there's continuously people are asking, how do you think about the political environment and what does that translate for my portfolio? And the short answer generally is they are really decoupled, and the success of Nvidia and Apple and all the the economic institutions in which we allocate capital to is connected but removed from whether there's a ship in the Tasman Sea, or whether Five Eyes is having internal struggles, or whether one swing state has lurched left or right. But the way people think is we kind of bring it all together, and actually there's a lot of incredible development and positive momentum behind the US economy.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, Stefan, because whether you like it or not, that's the wrong way to phrase it. Markets and economies and things are pretty agnostic to the political mode of organization. They are much more attuned or interested in certainty than they are whether it's a democracy or not. And so what people get nervous about is often a moral issue, quite rightly, and very much a concern with that. The markets don't read those signals the same way. And so whilst there's a lot of talk of oligarchyism, authoritarianism rising in parts of the world, in Europe and in the US and so on, the markets have less to say about that, just as the way it is. And so I think that that's right. And the other part of it as well is, I think, most large value companies in the US are nearing, correct me if I'm wrong, are nearing sort of the maximum of their valuations. They are pretty well valued. The PEs will tell us that they're very highly valued and overvalued, perhaps. But if you look at some pretty large value companies around the world, they're still very low valued. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think there's still a lot of room for growth globally. And the other part of that is, you would also argue that even though a lot of these large companies are based in the US, are physically there, they're global companies. And so they're not just going to suffer at the whims of a domestic outcome. I think that they ride the global seas. And those perhaps, even though they're shifting and rebalancing, they're not as choppy as we might think.
What's wonderful about what you just said, Alex, and I promise, Stefan, no information was given to Alex prior to this about our investment strategy. But that's exactly right. I think, we love the US because it's still growing at 2.whatever%, and all this development around AI and technology, they are the powerhouse of this. But markets are fully valuing the US growth at the moment. There's still opportunities within that, obviously, and US is a great market. But then you go across the pond to the UK and Europe, and there's a lot of interesting things going on within the same theme around AI technology, and out of those sectors as well. And those companies are really quite cheap.
Yeah, they're cheap. They are cheap in China at the moment. They're cheap in Latin America. And they're all doing interesting, good things. So yeah, I mean, I think there is opportunity out there for sure.
And I guess it just sort of emphasizes that diversification among two things. Geography is really important, and I think we meaning the markets haven't had to worry about that as much because the US was so strong. But I think that's ever more important, and that's NZ Funds is taking that I guess great returns we've made in the US and transitioning that capital to other markets.
Well, and luckily capital doesn't need a passport.
No,
so you can go very quickly wherever you want.
Or now you might be able to buy, citizenship in the US for a mere 10 million and won't need
5 million, but yeah. But the gold card. Yeah.
But then the IRS has got you forever, right? So.
Exactly. It's either US or Eritrea. Those are the two countries that get you forever. Yeah.
But then the other aspect of diversification is sectors. We're so focused on tech at the moment, not as in everybody, but sometimes a boring old hydroelectric dam in the south of the South Island that's generating renewable energy is exciting when it has a certain valuation.
And that's very important. The elevation of tech in the US is specifically because that's what's driving. But it's also those who are currently in charge. Yeah. Those are all the people surrounding the thing, and I absolutely agree with you. I think it's growing. It's got some interesting stuff going on, but so do many other industries, and you shouldn't lose sight of those for sure.
So I guess I'm New Zealand sitting on a cork on the ocean at one level of the world. How do you think the opportunities for us to participate and sort of reshape our future? Do you see any sort of like shining lights amongst it all, or is it just navigate as we go?
I think there's going to be there's going to have to be some very sophisticated thinking about how to navigate New Zealand's place. But as we will always say, and I think is always true, it is really to New Zealand's advantage that it is where it is, and that it's placed in, that it has a advanced society and industrial society and an educated part. It ticks all the boxes for being really well positioned. If you ask James Cameron, who just moved there, that's the best place to be right now. For all sorts of reasons. But I think that you would be hard pushed to find anyone who would say New Zealand is a bad place to be or a bad place to invest or a bad place. It is seen as a calm, level-minded sort of place to be where conversation is still in spoken about. There's not a lot of yelling and screaming and hyperbole and so on. And then if we sort of translate that from the political sphere into the economic sphere, I think that it's sort of the wait and see and pick out the opportunities when they are. Keep investing in the industries and the domestic growth points and buttons, education and the research elements. But I also think that New Zealand will suddenly be reintegrated into Australia and new alliances and into Europe in ways where they're suddenly looking around for friends and trading partners, having lost a very big one. And I think that is also an opportunity for closer ties and trade and economic things. So I personally very much like where New Zealand is. I very much imagine lots of people will be dreaming of moving there, and it's nice to see New Zealand, moving beyond property speculation to all sorts of other more sophisticated forms of wealth growth and thinking in a little bit more like that. So I think, I don't
Sounds
see,
like you should buy a passport too if you don't already have one.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, 5 million, is it? and I alluded right at the beginning. What does China want with New Zealand? Who knows? I mean, we can say all sorts of ways it'll play out, but I don't think it would ever be in Chinese interest to stifle or crush New Zealand in any way, it's a blip in the economy for China. But I think a calm, peaceful, successful New Zealand is in China's interests as well. And so I don't know why it would be particularly bellicose towards China, other than perhaps its Taiwan posture. So who knows? I mean, all bets are off in the world at the moment, but I don't foresee anything major coming at New Zealand that seems to be a giant red flag. Yeah.
And that is a beautiful moment to close our discussion today, Alex. Starting off with obviously the excitement that's within the States and the global domain, and then the calm that apparently exists in New Zealand. It's how people look at it from afar and how you feel about it when you live in the place can be quite different. But
interesting.
It's really nice to get that perspective. Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and look forward to speaking with you again in the future, Alex.
Thanks so much, Stefan. That was terrific. I enjoyed that. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Alex. Cheers.
See ya.
New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds Active Income Series, NZ Funds Active Inflation Series and NZ Funds Active Growth Series, together the NZ Funds Active Series, as well as the NZ Funds KiwiSaver Scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, NZ Funds Wealth Builder and NZ Funds Income Generator. For further information or to request a copy of the product disclosure statement for each of these, please contact NZ Funds or visit nzfunds.co.nz. This recording is provided for information purposes only. The information provided is not intended as a substitute for specific professional advice on investments, financial planning or any other matter. Past performance is not an